Thank you, Matthew, for that very generous introduction. If you live long enough, you do lots of things, I guess. I'd like to seize the occasion to thank Mr. and Mrs. Ranieri, not just for supporting the current project, but also because many of my students over the years have profited from Ranieri grants to do fieldwork in France. And so there's some piece of Ranieri grants in virtually everything that I'm going to present tonight. Yep, there we go. There we go. They're everywhere, right? We just spent a beautiful afternoon, beautiful day really, 6 hours of workshop with all of our distinguished participants coming from as far afield as Australia, many of them, 3 of them from Australia, who arrived yesterday, and so they were a little jet lagged, but they were good sports. And in a very specialist kind of way, we beat around a lot of interesting ideas and opened up some new frontiers for research, I think. My presentation tonight is going to be partly general, but partly focusing on the work that we've been doing over the past several years. I'm going to be very careful not to encroach on some of the really interesting material that's going to be presented tomorrow on Aurignacian music, on Neanderthal art, and other subjects. So I'm going to stay away from things that I'd be tempted to bring to you in detail because they'll be presented by much more authoritative people than me tomorrow. Oops. Matthew's already done a really good job of thanking the relevant people. This slide is just a way of crystallizing that. An event like this doesn't get put together overnight, and it isn't done by any single party. So thank you to all of the people mentioned here. So, origins of the arts. It's a very carefully hedged title. Some of you may be aware that anthropologists and art historians often don't get along, seldom communicate, and have very different perspectives on art. So in part, the focus on the arts is an attempt to, as you'll see in a subsequent slide, sort of move beyond the constraints of the monolithic notion of art that anthropologists for at least 3 generations have railed against. So you'll see how that plays out as we go along. But what about origins? You might imagine that we're just going to look at the earliest of everything everywhere. But that's really not my sense of the use of the term origins. Yes, it's origins in archaeological space and time. So yes, we'll be looking at the earliest evidence in a lot of different places for things that we can consider part of the arts. But I'm thinking more broadly of where the origins lie. For the arts, in particular in the brain, in social interaction, in cosmological and religious imagination, in landscapes and environments, which is so critical, for example, to Australian Aboriginal arts, and in technological transformation and what the French call savoir-faire, how we construct meaningful forms. So why the arts? As I said, it allows us some separation from our very culturally loaded and monolithic notion of art, which often distinguishes art from craft, which often distinguishes different levels of the arts, from the fine arts to the decorative arts to personal ornamentation, etc. But it also allows us to focus our attention on different modes of expression in different social contexts, in different archaeological regions and time periods, and different sensory modes, and even different regions of the brain. So we're going to tease apart these arts in the best way that we can archaeologically. So why not just fudge? Why not just say we're looking at the origins of symbolism? It's very current these days in the literature, and it's been very fashionable to use this term, but as you can see from this slide, that term is extremely restrictive in the sense that it forces us simply to refer to reduce things to a focus on things that stand for other things that aren't those things. And And it prevents us from enlarging our field of study to encompass the construction of meaningful materials, forms, sounds, smells, textures, etc. This may feel like a very anthropological approach, and you won't be surprised that it is. But for example, it allows us to raise questions about an object like the one you see here, which is a spectacular object for archaeologists. It's a Mousterian tool made by Neanderthals, made in perfectly transparent rock crystal. Where does an object like that situate in terms of the origins of the arts? Well, we may see that tonight. So which arts? What are we talking about? Music, personal adornment, plastic and graphic representation. Not much at all on language arts, because as you might imagine, we don't have much to talk about when it comes to language arts, except in a sort of theoretical and speculative way. And not much on performance, because for the periods that we're going to be looking at, there isn't much archaeological evidence. For somewhat later periods, there are, for example, in some caves, footprints that lead people to think that dancing was going on, that music was being played. But we don't have direct evidence from the period that we're going to be looking at. For those of you who are perhaps not embedded in the specialized history of Paleolithic archaeology, let me situate you, because merely in the European context, we're very old. This is Lascaux Cave. Lascaux Cave isn't even interesting to this conference. Lascaux is already halfway through European art history. Right? We're going to be looking primarily in the Western Eurasian sphere at objects that date between 40 and 35,000 years ago, including the famous Grotte, which dates to in the vicinity of 36,000 years ago. So there's as much time between Chauvet and Lascaux as there is between Lascaux and Picasso. Think of it in those terms. So when we're talking about origins, we're talking about very distant origins. The chronology of prehistory is a very complicated one. It varies from region to region. This is the Western European version of that. And you can see where Chauvet is situated in relation to Lascaux, in relation to other things. What precedes the chronology on this particular graph is a period when Europe was occupied by what many considered to be another species, the Neanderthals. And I'm going to show a few objects and talk about that a bit tonight, but Marco Perasani is here from Italy to really talk to us about that tomorrow. The name of the Neanderthal culture, for those of you who don't know, is the Mousterian. So when you see Mousterian on a slide, you know that it's produced by Neanderthals. Okay? And there's a big debate, as we'll see, about whether Neanderthals had art, whether they were capable of art. We fight about those sorts of issues, and we didn't fight about them today, but we certainly talked a lot about them. The sites that are represented in our conference, both tonight and tomorrow, are very widespread, and that's purposeful. If we have 3 people coming from Australia, it's because Southeast Asia has yielded in recent years a very important record for wall art, for personal ornamentation at a very distant time. And in fact, what has turned things upside down in a way is that for a long time, Western Europe was kind of considered to be the be-all to end-all. That is, it was imagined that the sequence that was found there with Neanderthals being replaced by modern humans and the origins of art 35 to 40,000 years ago was the process itself. But now we're beginning to realize that things are much older in Australasia and Southeast Asia, with rock art as old as 50,000 years in Australia. Modern humans appear to have been on Australia long before they were in Europe. So the planet has sort of turned sideways in the sense of where the action really lies. And it turns out that the record that I'm going to show you a considerable amount of tonight, the record from extreme Western Europe, which has dominated for so long, is really the end of a process. It's not the beginning of one. This is ever more so the fact because we have now firm evidence that the origins of our species, anatomically modern humans as some people like to call them, occurs somewhere in the vicinity of 200,000 years ago in Africa. So we have people who you would be comfortable sitting beside in this room existing on the African continent 200,000 years ago, and we don't see them get to Western Eurasia until approximately 40,000 years ago. That leaves 160,000 years of time for people with modern human brains to be doing interesting things. And we're beginning to see some of those things emerge in an ever-increasing archaeological pursuit of the African record. One complex fact to keep in mind is that that means that at the time that Neanderthals occupied Western Eurasia, in the period between roughly 200,000 years ago and roughly 40,000 years ago, Africa was entirely occupied by anatomically modern humans, who would ultimately disperse into Western Eurasia, replacing those anatomically modern humans, Neanderthal populations, who are sometimes referred to as archaic populations. Okay, that's the nuts and bolts out of the way. The whole issue of the origins of the arts then situates itself within the context of the dispersal of modern humans. Some people think that the modern human brain is enough to explain the origins of the arts in any given area, while others think that the roots go much further back, both in Africa and in other places. But we can see here that the arrival of people like ourselves in different regions of the globe occurs at different times. And of course, what has been surprising is the arrival of modern humans on Australia 60,000 years ago, a full 20,000 years before they ever got to Europe. Right? So, different world than it was when I started teaching at NYU, when it was enough to say that Neanderthals were replaced by modern humans, and modern humans had a brain and art and all of those wonderful things, and it was the great leap forward and major evolutionary Rubicon. Things are much more complicated. Let's keep it simple as far as art is concerned. This is really old stuff. Some of you will probably gag on this, but there's a very old piece of work by a guy named George Mills, who's probably been dead for 50 years. But it helps us to understand a little bit about the tension between art historians and anthropologists in a traditional way in respect to a definition of art, with anthropologists being much more concerned with the evocative potential of imagery and the ordering of ideas, and traditionally art historians being much more focused on the formal organization, arguing that there are universals in formal organization that allow us in the modern world to appreciate Lascaux, for example. For Mills, and this is the part that interests me the most, what makes poetry or any other medium art lies in its ordering of ideas. And key to this is metaphor, which gives to art its evocative potential. I think you'll see lots of indications of that tonight. And I probably wouldn't have said this 15 years ago, but I think we can actually talk about material metaphors, and I'll show you some of those tonight. So by controlling or creating blah, 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 art is thus controlled qualitative experience. Let's not get any more complicated than that. People are constructing images, sounds, textures, even smells in a way that controls the qualitative experience of those who are going to perceive those things. Sometimes that controlled qualitative experience gets extremely complicated to execute. Okay, let's a little sort of global background, and then I'll show you some of the recent discoveries that we've made. But a growing number of examples of expressive culture are being dated to before 40,000 years ago, and notably in Africa. And Ben Smith will be presenting this record in detail tomorrow. I'll just show you a couple of sort of landmarks, which include, for example, the site of Blombos Cave in South Africa, on the Indian Ocean coast of South Africa, which has yielded dates as old as 100,000 years ago, but primarily in levels dated to 73,000 years ago. Ochre processing, an abalone shell used as a hematite grinder, for example, and pieces of hematite that have incised geometric forms inscribed on them in well-dated well-excavated context. They're accompanied also by pierced shells, probably used as ornaments. This was a surprise. It's much older than many of us anticipated we would find that kind of material. Presumably being created, there are few human remains from Blombos cave, but the ones that there are consistent with anatomically modern humans at 73,000 years ago. Here's another case from southern Africa, incised, engraved ostrich eggshell beads, which are not beads, they're fragments, which are probably part of a water gourd, and in a context dated to 55,000 years ago. So this is a long time before even modern humans get to Eurasia. It certainly ranks among the earliest graphic representation anywhere on the planet. In Israel at Qafzeh, we have the collection by anatomically modern humans of shells that are naturally pierced. Those holes are all pierced by predators of shells. They're being collected from the shoreline, 65 kilometers from the site, and being brought back into the site. We can follow this pattern through time, in which we get the use of ostrich eggshell for the manufacture of formed beads, and also the production of enormous numbers of perforated shells, marine shells, for personal ornamentation. And we'll talk quite a bit tonight about personal ornamentation because it's a really critical aspect of the first evidence that we have for representation. The earliest, so far, and widely accepted evidence of a graphic image, that is, as something that is identifiable as something, comes from about 30,000 years ago. These are fragments of a shelter ceiling that collapsed into an archaeological layer dated to 30,000 years ago. It's a representation probably of an antelope. It could be something else. There's also a painted representation of a rhinoceros from the same context. So 30,000 years ago is somewhat later than we find for graphic imagery in, for example, Western Europe, some of the stuff that I'm going to be showing you. Another key issue of changing ideas, or a key focus of changing ideas, is the debate about whether Neanderthals had art. And this is a long-standing debate. Neanderthals have suffered for a long time by being imagined to not have symbolic capacities, by having brains that were different from ours, by not having language. And it kind of goes in cycles. We go back every 20 years, Neanderthals sort of come back and into the human fold, and then they're rejected back into some pre-human status. So we're in one of those moments. And the kind of traditional approach has been to see Neanderthals as being interested in form. Here, this example is interpreted. This is a Neanderthal hand axe in which a fossil shell has been preserved on the surface instead of being chipped away. I think it's more complicated than that, but this has been one of the objects that's been used to suggest that Neanderthals at least had a glimmering sense of an interest in form, and we'll see color as well. Most recently, some of you may have even read this research, published in Science. There have been claims for 65,000-year-old cave art in Spain. I'm deeply involved in this debate. I think it's wrong. I don't think it actually exists, but that's playing out in a scientific way at this very moment. It's based on the dating of calcite concretions that are overlying cave paintings, in particular at the sites of Castillo and La Pasiega in northern Spain. I'm the lead author on a paper that will appear soon in PNAS, co-authored by 44 of the leading experts on Paleolithic art, contesting the validity of the dating of this material to 60-some thousand years ago. We actually think it's Magdalenian, which places it at about 15 to 20,000 years ago. The problem is that, as you can see, we get dates on one side of the same rectangle at 3,070 years ago, and the same rectangle on the other side has yielded to them dates of 67,000 years ago. Hard to reconcile that. These are all the dates, and they've chosen the very oldest date to be the one to accept. All of the other dates are post 25,000 years ago. So I don't need to say more. We just don't believe that these claims have any veracity at all. Another recent find is a set of incisions on a cave floor that's attributed to the Mousterian. There's some doubt about that, on Gibraltar. But these are the kinds of things that we're going to great lengths to investigate, because they really represent the rare traces of a Neanderthal imposition of form on their immediate world. Curiously, and this was also reported relatively recently in a cave, the cave of Bruniquel in southwestern France, there are a series of structures that seem to be architectural features deep inside the cave of Bruniquel, that are dated to 176,000 years ago. But the walls of the cave are bare. So Neanderthals are a puzzle. They continue to be an enigma, and one of our speakers, Marco Perasani, will talk to us, I'm sure, tomorrow about his research at Fumani, in which they have evidence that feathers are being extracted that are, according to the authors of the study, are almost certainly used for personal ornamentation. And so their view of Neanderthals is something like the one that you see here, rather than the old version of them sort of slouched over, huddled in a rock shelter with relatively little going for them. And finally, in Croatia, a site that was excavated more than a century ago, Krapina, has yielded a series of bird talons, eagle talons, that show cut marks on them and some considerable evidence that they were suspended as ornaments by Neanderthals. And pigment. Neanderthal sites are loaded with it. It's often red, but most often it's black. And these are well-excavated examples from southwestern France of chunks of black manganese with scraping traces on them, used either to make powder or to apply directly to, for example, human skin, animal skin, or some soft substance. There's an alternative hypothesis about its use in fire, but I really don't want to go into that in detail tonight. Another term besides the Aurignacian culture, the Neanderthals, and the Mousterian is Châtelperronian. Châtelperronian is a period immediately after the Mousterian. It's characterized by a whole new technology, which involves the production of blades as stone tools, as blanks for stone tools, and also some indication of a rich array of personal ornaments. There are some severe stratigraphic problems with the site, but what we do know is that the site in question, Arcy-sur-Cure, was occupied by Neanderthals. There are several human remains attributable to Neanderthals. So if these things really are Châtelperronian, stratigraphically, they represent a significant corpus of personal ornamentation constructed by Neanderthals. I'm going to focus tonight on the period that's been my home for about 44 years now. I've worked in southwestern France for the past 44 years. And the sites that we've been excavating are representative of the Aurignacian culture. This is a culture named after the cave of Aurignac in the foothills of the French Pyrenees, which was first excavated in the early 1860s, 1860 maybe. And these archaeological cultures are defined by the material culture, by the kinds of blades and tools and weapons that are employed. One of the things that came to pass at the beginning of the 20th century was the recognition that the Aurignacians were prolific producers of what was, even at the time, understood to be graphic art. This is their world. This is the extent of their world, including the glaciers, of roughly 40,000 years ago. And we're talking about people who are hunting and gathering, who live in a cold, rigorous environment for the most part, who hunt a variety of cold-adapted animals. In my area, it's reindeer. We call them, I grew up in Canada, so we call them caribou. Some people like to call them reindeer caribou, but Rangifer tarandus is the species name. In the past decade and a half, there have been really major discoveries, some of them by us, some of them by other people, of Aurignacian graphic and plastic arts and personal ornamentation. You can see some of those things here. I'll show you better pictures in a moment. But for a period that on which we depended for a set of poorly excavated sites from the beginning of the 20th century, we've now returned to a number of these sites and dramatically improved our understanding of the chronology and the context of these things. So I hope to convince you of that. So the modes of representation that I want to talk about here tonight are personal ornaments, instrumental music, a little bit, because I don't want to steal the thunder of Anna, who's going to present a wonderful demonstration of Aurignacian flute music tomorrow, and graphic and plastic imagery, both sculpture and engraving. First, personal ornamentation. What's this all about? Why are anthropologists so interested in personal ornamentation? I started working on personal ornamentation about 30 years ago, and I was one of the pioneers. I couldn't get any funding because nobody would believe me that the way you decorated your body had any evolutionary importance whatsoever. And finally, today, personal ornamentation has become the defining characteristic of being modern, culturally modern. So I feel very vindicated by all of this. And as someone who worked in isolation for at least a decade, I'm now surrounded by hundreds of colleagues around the world who are focusing on the study of personal ornaments. Why are they so interested? Well, for these reasons. Because personal ornamentation is a window into social life. It's a window into the way societies are constructed internally, how they organize themselves, how they represent themselves to other geographically organized societies. And as we'll see in a minute, what you ornament your body with is very representational, is evocative of often deeply held beliefs, thoughts, cosmologies. And these are just some ethnographic examples, not suggesting that any of these people are prehistoric in any sense of the word, but these are hunter-gatherer examples of people who decorate their bodies in ways that are extremely complicated and meaningful within their particular social context. So that's why we're scraping away at these personal ornaments. So let's look at some of them. One of my goals tonight is to just show you a lot of really pretty material and to share with you my exploration of the Aurignacian over the past few years. Pierced teeth. This is a sort of classic image you have. You think about a prehistoric person and you often imagine them having a bare tooth necklace around their neck or something like that. It's not quite that simple. The people that I work with or work on were hunting. Roughly 90% of their meat diet is composed of reindeer. And I suppose over the years I've studied in the vicinity of 3,000 to 4,000 personal ornaments from the Aurignacian, including perhaps 1,000 pierced teeth. And how many reindeer do you suppose are in that sample? 0. The animal that's most represented in their food garbage is the animal that isn't at all represented in terms of their teeth in the pierced teeth assemblage. So what is represented? Cuddly little foxes, probably not viewed as cuddly, but wolves, red deer, the elk, the wapiti, if you like, same species. And they're using wapiti vestigial canines, primarily, this nubby little tooth that occur 2 per individual. And when they don't have them, as you can see here, the Aurignacians are doing something interesting. They're making their own. Out of what? Out of ivory and out of soapstone, those two materials. Materials that are, in my region at least, are never used for practical technological purposes. Okay? So these are examples. The bottom one is from Abri Castanet. It's a facsimile of a red deer canine dated to 37,000 years ago. So facsimiles. If you saw a documentary that we did with Alan Alda a few years ago, you may remember that there was a segment in which he and I had a really big laugh about wearing grandma's teeth. Because as we'll see in a moment, some of these teeth are actually human teeth that are being worn as ornaments. So wapiti, hyenas, these are real teeth from real archaeological sites that you're looking at here. Bears, horses, bovids, and just an aside, horses and bovids are really two of the animals when we begin to see representations of animals, graphic representations. Those are the two animals that they seem to be most interested in and are most represented. And they're two of the animals that are least represented in the food debris. So there's something else that's interesting about these animals. And humans. We now have 5 Aurignacian sites from southwestern France in which we have perforated human teeth. I think the total sample is now 14 human teeth. Something to understand is that in the entire European Aurignation, we don't have a single burial. So we don't have any dead humans wearing ornaments. We don't have any dead humans buried, but we have teeth. Apparently, the evidence on the teeth is that they were extracted from corpses that still had flesh on them. And they're being perforated and apparently worn as ornaments. So what could be more metaphorical than that? And finally, the Aurignation goes back to about 41,000 years ago in a form that we call the Proto-Aurignation. And this is an object from recent excavations that I've been working on. It's a pendant, if you like, with a rather odd form, which may be anthropomorphic or who knows, with a beautifully drilled perforation in it, and dating to 41,000, at least 41,000 years ago. And if that isn't interesting enough, it turns out that the Aurignacians, at a very early moment, were the first to exploit amber as a raw material for making jewelry, right? So the first amber beads and pendants are made 40,000 years ago by these Aurignacian people. So odd choices of material because, as you might imagine, amber serves absolutely no technological purpose. If you're collecting it from the environment, you're collecting it to wear it, to transform it into ornaments at some considerable cost in terms of getting to the sites, knowing where to find this raw material. If I said, go find me some amber in southwestern France tomorrow, you wouldn't have a clue where to even start. But they knew all of the sources. And we know that it's being extracted, it's being mined from Cretaceous, so roughly 65-million-year-old geological beds by Aurignacian peoples. A little further afield in sites that I've worked on in European Russia, we find other odd choices for raw material, which are rather stunning. This is a fossil squid, the rostrum of which, the spine of which, is being segmented and used for the production of beads. Right? This also is a mining operation. This is geological extraction of these fossils for their transformation into what you see here is these rather lustrous beads that you could easily confuse with amber. But the raw material that they use par excellence, and Claire Heckel will be talking more about this tomorrow, is what's hanging off the front of these 10,000-pound creatures. Mammoth tusk, ivory. The Aurignacians exploit ivory in a very intensive way, almost always only for art and ornamentation. It's a privileged material for those purposes. And what you're looking at here are a series of formed beads, each of which takes 3 hours to produce. And the lighter colored ones are ivory from the tusks of woolly mammoths. There's just one catch. There were no woolly mammoths in southwestern France at this time. So what they're doing, from all indications, is they're collecting old fossil, subfossil, dried up ivory from the environment around them and transforming that into personal ornaments. In Germany, we'll see that it's a rather different situation where woolly mammoths were really alive and they were exploiting the ivory from living mammoths and, well, dead mammoths, and transforming it into ornaments as well. So ivory is an interesting material. What is it about ivory? We'll talk more about that in a second. You might notice that these beads are extremely lustrous. The three lower right-hand ones in that image are not ivory, they're talc, they're soapstone, which is being obtained at 1,800 meters altitude, 350 kilometers from the site in which they're found, high in the French Pyrenees. Okay, so long-distance procurement of materials that ultimately are simply going to be turned into, ornaments. So when I first started submitting grant proposals back in the 80s, that's the response I got. Oh, these are just ornaments. What's he doing? Why is White destroying his career by studying these things? So, this is what the raw material looks like in nature. It's not very interesting, for our eyes at least. It's only interesting if you have the technology to transform it, which involves, as we'll see, the use of metallic abrasives to polish this material and to bring out very brilliant, lustrous surfaces. If you've ever touched soapstone, you know it's got that warm, je ne sais quoi aspect to it. And they're exploiting the same talc mines that are being exploited today. This is the largest talc mine in the world, and it's in central French Pyrenees, and it's exactly the same place that Aurignacians were getting their talc 37 to 40,000 years ago. More amber a little later, but impressive technology of reduction. This, you can see the scale, that's 1 millimeter. These are beads that are practically microscopic, and that in modern archaeology we have to develop extremely rigorous techniques of recovery. You can imagine trying to find things that are 3 millimeters in length, and we've developed a whole series of sieving and sorting operations to do 100% recovery of these minuscule ornaments. Aurignacian beads usually range from about 6 millimeters down to as small as 2 millimeters. And you never see them in the excavation, you only find them in the sieves. And of course, the other key raw material for ornaments is marine shell. These are the marine shells from our site, Abri Castanet, with really good dates at 37,000 years ago. And you can see there are several species. 4 of those species, I don't know if you know where I'm talking. I should have showed you a map, I suppose. Abri Castanet is in the southwest corner of France. It's about 200 kilometers east of Bordeaux. And 4 of these species come from 800 kilometers away on the Mediterranean. So here we have objects that are being used as ornaments that are making their way across a large swath of extreme Western Europe in order to get where they end up. Something to keep in mind is, of course, when we find these ornaments archaeologically, they tend to have lost all their protein and they're kind of washed out and white and chalky. But I simply put this olivella shell in, a modern olivella shell in here to remind you what these shells would have looked like in their initial, in their Aurignacian life, if you like. Oh, this is that facsimile from Castanet, but just to give you a sense of the use of ivory to make these fakes, and also the fact that you can see, even with an untrained eye, you can see the presence everywhere on these objects of red ochre, which is in powdered form is being used to polish all of these objects. It's a fine abrasive, it's a metallic abrasive, and it's already there 40,000 years ago in the domain of personal ornamentation. More fakes, more knockoffs. Apparently when they don't have shells, but they have some of this rough and ready ivory, they're making copies of shells, identifiable to species, right? Knockoffs. Right? But I want to bring your attention to something, because we look at these things as fake shells. But there's really no difference, cognitively, conceptually, and operationally, between representing in a sculpted form a horse and representing in a sculpted form a shell. These are among the first realistic sculptures that we have on the planet, right? And they coincide with, for example, some of the small sculpted animals that I'll show you later from southern Germany from the same dates. So it may seem funny that they're making knockoffs, and Alan Alden and I had a big laugh about that, but there's something really quite significant here in taking something from nature and representing it in another medium, right? In our work, and is often the case with anthropological approaches, we seek as much context as we possibly can. And we practice what the French call a paleoethnographic approach. It's an ambitious term for what really is a kind of difficult set of procedures. What we do is we excavate sites when we can, and under close stratigraphic control, we excavate sites as if they were living places, as if they were campsites. And we map all the objects on these surfaces, and we look at their spatial organization and placement, and we try to draw conclusions about the way people were organized, socially, technically, on a daily basis. And I'll just show you some initial results. This is Abri Castanet. This is the lower level at Abri Castanet, where the Aurignacians moved on to the bedrock of the shelter. They lived on the floor of the shelter, under an overhang that was within reach above their heads, but which was 7 meters deep. This was a very deep shelter, a pretty interesting place to stay. The valley is cold itself, but they drilled holes in the front of the shelter and dropped animal skins down to cover the front of the shelter, with their fireplaces behind, rather cozy. And they lived there from January to April, we know, from the seasonality of the deaths of the animals in the site. So that's just a little bit of very quick context. And this is the fire feature that they left behind. Our interest is in the fire feature, certainly, but it's also in the way that a number of different activities are linked to, are anchored to those fire features, that fireplace. This is what 16,000 and some objects, is that what it says? 18,000 and some objects looks like, plotted in three-dimensional space to a millimeter accuracy. And we can, for any of those objects, we can recover its exact place and its relationship to all other objects in the excavation. And what we can see here, I may have to show you if I can master this thing. What we can see here are 3 separate fire features and a 4th one over here. And I'll show you a slide in a moment where we can see the distribution of beads and bead production debris. But I'll tell you first that essentially that's the way it works. Essentially all of the pierced teeth are found from this cluster. Essentially all of the bead fabrication debris is found on this corner, on this side, in 1.5 meters square. Associated with this fire feature. There are hot spots where it's pretty clear that somebody sat 37,000 years ago and manufactured ivory and soapstone beads. So when I say paleoethnographic approach, what we're really trying to do is put the meat back on the bones in terms of what was actually going on at this site. This is 14 years of excavation over 25 square meters, right? So you can imagine the meticulous nature of the procedures. When we begin to map, as I said, these things, we can see all sorts of interesting patterns. Finished beads have a particular distribution, 2 hot spots, and bead fabrication debris shows similar sorts of hot spots. So we seem to have people going from beginning to end in the fabrication process of personal ornaments. So we begin to really feel like we're getting into the lives of prehistoric people. Something I've argued for a long time is that if you look at the total corpus of personal ornaments in the Aurignacian, what you see is that there's a shared quality to virtually the entire corpus. These are the materials that they're using. Mother of pearl, soapstone, ivory, tooth enamel. What do they have in common? Particular quality of luster, both visual and tactile. Right? They're shiny and they're sexy. Right? And the sample here is probably more than 2,000, maybe 3,000 objects. So it's a surprising choice. And that's what I see as linking those particular choices. There may be other possibilities. Second example I want to present to you is Aurignacian graphic and plastic imagery. And I'm going to focus on some of the stuff that we've been doing in the classic Vézère Valley of southwestern France. If you have ever been to southern France and you're interested in prehistory, you may have visited caves like Fond de Gaume and Cambarelle and Pechmerle and sites like that. Well, this is the very area where research started back in the 1860s. It took me 20 years before they let me put trowel to ground. This is sacred French territory. And I've spent almost 20 years now excavating some of the key sites in this region with my French colleagues. I direct excavations by a French-American team. It's a collaborative international effort. The very earliest Aurignacian engravings date to 1909, and a Swiss archaeologist named Otto Hauser was the first to discover them. He had the merit of discovering them when nobody else had imagined that such things could exist. He completely misinterpreted them. He wanted to see animal forms on them, but it turns out that they have those weird forms that we call vulva, or that some people call vulva, on them. These were transported back. They were transported to Germany, and they still exist, fortunately for us. A lot of this material was dispersed early on. Buying and selling and dispersal of collections is a horrible handicap, but it was absolutely common at the time. This is where we've spent a lot of our time. This is in the Vallon de Castelmerle. It's between, if you know this region, it's between Montignac and Les Aisies, about halfway. And these are the two key sites, Abri Blanchard and Abri Castanet, which are at the base of this high limestone cliff, and they both are collapsed natural rock shelters. So the ceiling collapses in and covers over and seals in all of the deposits that represent people living in these sites. You can see the quality of the excavations. This is Denis Perroni, who was the prehistorian, but he was the boss of this other guy who's seen excavating. He's a local farmer, and he's doing all of Perroni's excavations. The records are really quite amusing but sad. Perroni visits the site about 5 or 6 times during the course of the excavation, and each time it's to bring dynamite to blow up limestone blocks. It's not surprising that we have a lot of limestone blocks where we have an engraving that goes off the edge, and the edge is a fresh break, and we don't have the other half because it probably exploded into a million pieces. So these are very rough and ready techniques. They're not doing any spatial recording. The stratigraphy, the stratigraphic analysis is very rough and ready, and it's often Marcel Castanet alone, who in the off-season, the off-farming season, is doing the excavations all by himself. Right? So today, as you might imagine, we work with multidisciplinary teams of 20 or 30 scientists, and so this is a rather quaint picture of the way many of the traditionally recovered objects were acquired, including a category of objects that art historians and anthropologists have been intrigued by. They're these often round forms with a slit on them. And in 1910, there's a famous postcard written by the Abbé Breuil, who, having been sent a photograph of one of these newly discovered versions, identifies it as a female human vulva, a human female vulva. And from thenceforth, we carry the load of interpreting these things as female sexual organs, even when in many cases they are less than convincing as that. But it's a rather amusing fact that Abbé Breuil, who was a French priest, should be the expert who was brought in to identify the subject in question. These two were interpreted as vulva, although I'm sure you, like me, probably won't be able to see the relationship. But Abri Castanet has some very deeply incised and engraved geometric forms, often round, often double contoured pieces. And I mentioned the difficulty with these old collections. There are two additional blocks. These are on display in the museum in Les Aisies. There are two additional blocks at the Field Museum in Chicago that refit with this, but they were separated and sent off in one of those initial acquisitions. It's always surprising to us to go into these sites. And the first thing you want to know is, where did Peyroney excavate? Where did he put his back dirt? Et cetera, et cetera. And you always excavate part of the back dirt to try and figure out what he kept, what he threw away, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes it's really surprising what he threw away. In this case, my two colleagues here are trying to manipulate a block that weighs 250 kilos. And that block has bas-relief sculptures on it. It has perforations on it that are of Aurignacian age, and Peyroney simply left it in the back dirt, along with numerous other objects of this kind. These sites were so rich, and there was so much material, and limestone blocks are cumbersome. I can attest to that. They simply left them. They made a selection and left them. And many of them never saw the light of publication, et cetera, et cetera. So, as I said, we've increased our sample of such works of art by about 30%. Many of those objects come from the back dirt of the initial excavators who simply left these things behind or never saw them, right? But our goal was to find things in place and to excavate them and to date them. And this is a very cleaned profile that Peyroney left behind at Abri Castanet, and that big K in the middle there is Block K, famous Block K. After excavating on the other side of the site, we came back here to try to understand something about the geology, and we decided that if we were going to do that, we had to remove this big limestone block, but we understood that limestone blocks can have things on them. So. And they're often thought to have been on the underside of the collapsed ceiling. So we spent weeks excavating this thing. We very carefully, using medieval quarrying techniques, we split it slice by slice in a very clean way, peeled the block away onto sandbags, and examined the undersurface. And the third block that came off, the third slice that came off of this block, my colleague Catherine Cotin was over my shoulder, and she said, "Oh merde, un vulve." And so we had the first vulva excavated at Abri Castanet since 1912, and we had it in absolutely perfect archaeological context. And what we were able to show was that it was a ceiling block, that it had fallen with a big bang, almost certainly. It fell directly onto the Aurignacian surface with stone tools and bones and everything on that surface. And we had individual stone tools that had been broken into 30 or 40 pieces by the impact of this thing coming down. So we had prima facie evidence of the context of these engravings, which we'd never had before. Now we know that the ceiling above their heads was engraved, right? So that was a major feat. We dated bone remains from the surface beneath the block, and also that were insinuated into the engraving itself, and they consistently came out at 37,000 years ago, calibrated. So this was a major feat. It's the kind of thing that you spend years of meticulous work doing, and you never really expect to find anything, but here it is. It doesn't look like much, but it's really important in terms of the information it provides us about the context of many of these engravings and their date. What you're looking at in the left-hand photo is the contact between the engraved surface and the Aurignacian living surface immediately beneath it, within which it's in contact. There's no sedimentation between the surface and between the living surface and the undersurface of the block. These are just dates It's interesting to throw these dates in because they situate you with respect to Grotte Chauvet. We're about 1,000 to 1,500 years older than Grotte Chauvet at Abri Castanet with these images. So. The sister site, which you saw in that previous photo, is Abri Blanchard. Abri Blanchard was excavated beginning in 1909, and it yielded, it's probably the richest Aurignacian site that's ever been excavated anywhere. It yielded, for those of you who know a little bit about the Aurignacian, it yielded more than 200 split-based projectile points, which is almost as many as exist for the rest of France, I would guess. But it also yielded to the good old Marcel Castanet, who was working as a paid employee of this guy, who was a hotel operator, who was just interested in archaeology. And they were to recover a whole series of engraved blocks and pierced blocks. You'll see one or two on there that have holes in them. These are called pierres à anneaux, blocks with hooks in them, if you like. And they provided some spatial information that allows us, combined with what we know from Abri Castanet, to know that these blocks are almost always at the drip line of the rock shelter. They're actually putting these hooks, gouged hooks, into the underside of the drip line. Perrine's hypothesis was that they were dropping animal skins from the front of the shelter to cover it over. That doesn't seem at all unlikely to me. In addition, you can see on the right-hand slide here a small sample of the several hundreds, nearly 1,000 personal ornaments that were recovered from the Aurignacian levels. And this site is a site that covered 120 square meters. So this is not a gigantic place. This is a small, relatively small rock shelter with just a gigantic quantity of stuff that we're interested here, including bichrome paintings, for example. Nobody knew what to do with this painting because it was so out of place. Then nobody could believe it was from Abri Blanchard or that it was Aurignacian. And then when Grotte Chauvet was discovered, all of a sudden people could see similarities between some of the images at Chauvet and this strange Aurignacian block from 1911 that had been found at Abri Blanchard. Something I'd like to insist on a little bit is on the fact that while there are images that you can clearly identify and characterize, on the left here you have a sample of things that are interpreted as vulva. By the way, there are other interpretations of these. Some people think that they're representations of horse hoof prints and other kinds of things. But many of these blocks are hard to make sense of. There's a lot of engraved lines, a lot of superposition, and it's especially troublesome when they're fragments of larger blocks because you can't really see where that line was going or what it was to become. So it's like doing a jigsaw puzzle when you have probably only a third of the pieces, right? It's really hard to figure out where you are in the context of a complete image, if there ever was a complete image. A couple of examples here that are interesting. These punctuated rows of meandering punctuations, meandering punctuations, are a very characteristic aspect of Blanchard as well as a number of other sites. Just to give you a sense of how a new discovery can lead you to go back to old stuff and figure it out, what you have in that block in the middle is a representation of a lion from Abri Blanchard. And it is Chauvet. It's a Chauvet lion, but nobody even saw that lion until we had Chauvet, and they could identify it as a lion. Right? It was just this enigmatic image that nobody could figure out. And all of a sudden, when you have a photograph of the Chauvet lions in hand, you have your Blanchard lion, which is basically contemporaneous or close to being contemporaneous. More punctuations. This is a very famous one. If any of you remember the work of Alexander Marshak, he thought this was a lunar calendar, which I don't. But we get this use of punctuation frequently. And I never expected in my career to find something that would, I don't know, add to this corpus in an interesting way, but we did. We went back to Abri Blanchard, and Marcel Castanet was a very thorough guy. He excavated pretty much the whole site. But when he did his initial trench, he dumped all of his back dirt to the left, and then he moved to the right. And he never came back to dig under his initial back dirt. So he left us 8 square meters of intact Aurignacian deposit at Abri Blanchard. So we felt lucky just to have that. But we were to get a lot more lucky in a short while, because in that area that you just saw, highly concreted area, this block emerged at the end of the first season of excavation. This block emerged. It has nothing on its upper surface, but we learned our lesson from the other block, from Abri Castanet. We carefully excavated this block, and probably one of the great moments of my career, we turned it over, and we have this fantastic engraved aurochs with punctuated design associated with it, in a context which we've now firmly dated to 38,000 years ago, which probably dates virtually the entire corpus of blocks from Abri Blanchard that were excavated in the old days. Okay, so I don't know if I hope you can see the aurochs. This is a kind of interpretive image here. The whole surface is prepared. The surface of the block is prepared. The dots go on first. The aurochs is built into the dots. And then that hole in the middle is gouged into the block. And it's turned upside down. It's turned over in the ground. And we know by going back to the archives that many of the blocks from Blanchard and Castanet were found with their engraved surfaces downward. So there's something interesting going on here. It's not a ceiling block, it's a freestanding block that was in the middle of all of the garbage of everyday life. We found more than 2,500 lithic stone tools, stone artifacts, in the immediate area around the block. And we have an extraordinary refitting rate. That may sound like technical jargon. 75% of all of the flint objects refit with some other flint object. It's like this is absolutely intact. The distribution is absolutely intact around this block, with us being able to put together all of these things. They're napping flint right here around this block, and we're able to put back many of the cores from which they're napping flint. And we have tools directly associated with this block that bear the distinct traces of having been used as engraving tools on limestone. So we think we probably have the very tools that were used. We've done a huge amount of experimentation. We know what that ware looks like. We know the gestures that they were using. And we seem to have just an 8 square meter moment in Aurignacian time that we could never have imagined finding. We went back to another side, which is, if you've ever read any of Whitney Davis's stuff on the origins of the art, he focuses very heavily on engraved limestone blocks from Abri Cellier. It's one of the classic sites. Excavated, can't even say excavated, butchered by an American team from Beloit College in 1927. They recovered 13 limestone blocks with engravings on them, many vulva, but also an ibex and some other things. And so our goal was to go back to the site, hoping that, like at Blanchard, we could find some intact area where we could give some context to these early discoveries. Beyond all of our expectations, we found some stuff. This is the last day of excavation, or the last week of excavation in 1927. And what you can see here is a witness section that they were required to leave here, unexcavated. And piled up against it is a whole bunch of blocks, right? And so I've made it my business to do all of the archival and historical research before we go to the field. And this pile of blocks intrigued me, and I presumed it contained some of the blocks that were in the museum. And when we actually got to the site and began excavating, we realized that all of those blocks were still there, sitting right there. They'd been moved around a little bit, and the witness section had been pillaged, but all those blocks were there. And much to our surprise, there were 14 engraved Aurignacian blocks in that pile that no one had ever seen before and that had never been published. These are the ones from 1927. I don't want to focus on them. I want to show you some of the new stuff and make a couple of points. So it's at this end of the shelter. underneath this fragment of roof collapse, this whole area here is intact. We only had about 3 square meters, but we actually had one of the blocks found in place with dates at 38,000 again. This is what it looks like. All the blocks from 1927 are in green, and all our blocks are the ones not in green. So we've actually doubled the sample from Abri Cellier. Why is that important? Because it completely changes, for example, the species composition in the subjects. We have 3 woolly mammoths that we never had before. They're representing woolly mammoths that were never seen. We have what appears to be a human form. I'll just show you some of these. As I mentioned to you earlier, these Aurignacian blocks, sometimes it's just a matter of a line or 2 lines or things that don't make any sense. They're marking things, and it's not clear why. But I'll show you the full range of variability in what we found. Some of these things are ceiling collapse blocks. This is one of those famous anneaux, the hooks that are gouged into the ceiling to suspend who knows what, either animal skins or perhaps meat or some other thing. But this one happens to have a woolly mammoth profile adjacent to it. If you've seen the woolly mammoths from Chauvet, you can easily identify this as a mammoth profile. This is a really spectacular object in its simplicity, besides one of these anneaux. And more dots. We've published a couple of papers, and they've sort of been sold in the media as the origins of quantilism, which is half true. I suppose. But again, it's this use of dots to construct the form. In this case, almost certainly of a woolly mammoth, and they've actually adapted by sculpting the upper edge of this block to give the hump and the contours of the mammoth. It's reminiscent of an object from Chauvet. I'm not going to show you much from Chauvet because I'm going to show you a whole bunch of that tomorrow. But this rhinoceros from Chauvet, for example, which is constructed entirely of dots. And it gets even more interesting than that because those dots are produced in a particular way. Okay? It's interpreted as a rhinoceros in relationship to a number of other rhinoceri that are found at Chauvet. It's constructed of all of these dots, and you can begin to see, in this case, that those dots have kind of parasitic marks associated with them that turn out to be finger marks, right? Because the paint is actually being applied, the dots are actually being applied like this. The palm of the hand is being painted with a big gooey red dot, and it's being applied to the wall in each case. So they're constructing a woolly rhinoceros out of, I don't remember the number of these things, but it's like 85 or 90 individual dots constructed by painting the hand and applying the hand to the wall, which is a pretty interesting conceptually pretty interesting thing to see people doing. This is one of our other engravings from Cellier. You can see why some of them they either missed or they thought, oh, that's not worth bringing back, because some of these things weigh 30, 40 kilos. So, and in the days when they didn't even have an automobile, it's kind of hard. But sometimes you see a horse and it's, looks like my daughter probably did it when she was 4. But there it is. And it's part of this corpus. So there's stuff that's really well executed, that's convincing and credible, and then there's other stuff beside it that you're not so impressed by, except by the fact that it was done 38,000 years ago, which makes it worth taking back to the museum, I'd say. And then we found one block in place, which we have trouble interpreting, but it's completely engraved and marked, and it was found where you can see the arrow up there in stratigraphic context with a direct radiocarbon date on its immediate context. That's what it looks like for what it's worth. It's not much, but there it is in context, in place, giving us a date for at least one of the Cellier objects. One of the things that we focus on in this Aurignacian corpus is what they're representing. What are the subjects? What are the themes? And you can see here that there are some zoomorphic images that are difficult to interpret. There are 4% of the Vézère sites, of the Vézère objects are mammoths. Ibex, which is a curious choice because ibex is almost never in the fauna. Mammoths are never in the fauna. And horses, which are in the fauna but in very rare frequencies. And then a huge proportion, 68% of all of the Vézère blocks in the Aurignacian carry what are interpreted as female sex organs, right? Which you can believe or not believe. But they are these conventional, repetitive images that are more often circular than triangular and with a median slit. That takes us back to the Abbé Broye in 1910, and we don't seem to be, when we see these things, we don't seem to be able to see them as anything else. But there are a lot of them. There are really a lot of them. This is more for the images on the bottom than for the graphs, but you can see some of the images from the Aurignacian. Here's one of these hooks. Here's a triangular thing that looks more like a tooth than a vulva to me, but it falls within the category of vulva. There's, believe it or not, a phallus represented on here from Abri Castanet. And then in a small number of sites, we have what appear to be felid paw prints represented. And I don't know if you can make out the rhinoceros, but there are two horns on this end from one of the other sites. Not a single Aurignacian site in the Vézère has a rhinoceros bone in it. So it's really a kind of enigma that the animals that are being represented the most are very little present or not present at all in the faunal assemblages. Moving a little further afield, we can see that this corpus of Aurignacian graphic imagery is variable. There are similarities across regions, which we will look at in just a second, just a glimpse of. But here's a site from Provence, from the Garde, southeastern France. And you can see another approach. This is dated to 37,400, I think. So it's basically Abri Castanet, but in another region of France associated with early Aurignacian. And you can see a woolly mammoth in a rather different style. Looks much more like some of the Chauvet mammoths than those from the Vézère. And then I don't know if you can make out the image on the right, but it's a felid. If you find the head, I don't have a close-up, but it's ferocious. It's got huge canine teeth. But it's represented in this kind of serpentine way with application of the paint by the hand. They're just dipping their hand in the paint and dragging their hand across to form the lines here. So. Since we don't really have anyone here who's a specialist in the German Aurignacian, I want to show you just a few objects which are really spectacular and are really different from the Vézère. I mean, let's face it, these are people living at the same time in Western and Central Europe. I don't know how far away Schwabia is from the Vézère, but it's probably, 700 kilometers, 800 kilometers, maybe something like that. These are Aurignacians by their stone tool industry, by their bone and antler industry, etc. But it's really like day and night. Their mode of expression is miniature sculptures, and their personal ornamentation is very rich, but completely different from the Vézère. Those basket-shaped beads that I showed you earlier, there aren't any. It's all other kinds of forms. It looks like a different planet from the Vézère Valley at the same time in Western Europe. So we're beginning to see regional variation here enter the picture at a very early time. None of these little objects that you're about to look at is more than 4.5 centimeters from front to back. So they're lost in the palm of your hand. They're in polished ivory with over markings in some cases. Often it's the same kind of hatch mark over marking. And what you're looking at here is the underside of this, and you can see that there's a perforation, there's a space between the legs, both on the front and the back on this thing. As in France, the back dirt received a lot of stuff. And this little mammoth sculpture was found by Nick Conard's team in the back dirt from the 1931 excavations. Hard to imagine they could be throwing something like this out, but as Claire Heckel reminded me earlier, when they were, and she's excavated in this back dirt, they found entire mammoth tusks that they simply threw over their shoulder into the back dirt. So, very different approach from today. Today, we just cringe at the idea of excavating one of these sites in a few weeks, which today would take us 25 years to excavate. So a lot was lost. And they got all the easy sites. They got all the obvious sites. Nick Conrad's team also has gone back to Hohlefels, the cave of Hohlefels. And there we'll see with Anna's presentation tomorrow, we'll see a flint, we'll hear a flute, we'll hear a flute. I don't know if it is a flute. Is it a flute technically? Wind instrument? It's a wind instrument. We had this discussion today about flutes. And associated in the same level with that flute was this figure, a representation of a woman, a rather odd one. And what you can see at the top there is not her head. It's a little hook to suspend this object. So she's in the lowest most level, which Nick claims to be in the 40,000 range. I think it's probably not quite that old, but he and I can fight that out. Right. And then at a nearby site found on the days immediately before the declaration of the Second World War, the pieces of this sculpture were found. It's been named the Lion Man. It has been put back together from I don't know how many pieces. It was rediscovered in the drawers in the 1970s by one of my colleagues who put it back together and realized that it was a sculpture. It's 30-some centimeters high. This is a substantial object. Recently, they've taken the whole thing apart again because they have literally had hundreds of individual pieces of ivory that they suspected went back into this. And they, over the course of how much time, I don't know, several months, maybe several years, they put the whole thing back together again, and they found more of the face and all sorts of things. So if you saw this object 5 years ago, it's not the same object anymore. It's got much more of it intact. So as I said, some shared images across regions. Rhinoceros from Coloboia in Romania, beside one from Fongal, which they could be confused one with the other. Vulva from different regions. Bovids or horses from different regions. But then there's this huge range of variability between miniature sculptures being the dominant mode and engraved limestone blocks being the dominant mode in another area. So it's a complex geography. This is a closing slide. I'm going to show one or two slides, but I don't want to steal Anna's thunder. She's going to show us more slides and play some of these things for us tomorrow. But the astonishing thing that is emerging in the Aurignacian is the existence of wind instruments, several of them. There are some from France, but they're predominantly from southern Germany. This is a rather extraordinary one, which is sculpted entirely of ivory, if you can imagine sculpting a flute out of a wind instrument out of ivory. The reconstruction of it, which Anna will be playing tomorrow, is this. This is in the vicinity 35 to 40,000 years old. This is a replica that's playable, and you'll hear that tomorrow. And so I don't want to say any more than that because you're going to see something really quite spectacular and hear something rather spectacular tomorrow. But part of the Aurignacian package is wind instrumentation and sounds, the control of sound. So our image of Aurignacian people is not people huddled in a rock shelter against the elements, doing all they can just to stay warm. It's children playing and listening to music and all sorts of other activities, wearing elaborate clothing, decorated, and at least in the southern French case, living in rock shelters with images of female vulva and horses and bovids over their heads and on blocks surrounding them. Seems like a pretty rich living environment, but it's one that's ripe with imagery, with textures, with colors, and products of the human imagination. So back to our old Mills definition of art, controlled qualitative experience, well, that's really what we're looking at, and sometimes it's really a complicated control. So all of this is Europe after 40,000 years ago. And I think what's unique about what we put together in this conference is that we have a lot of other places represented that move us beyond this kind of Eurocentric perspective. We have 3 people who are so jet-lagged, they flew in from Australia yesterday, who are really going to provide us with a view of the sort of state of the art, state of the question for places like Australia and Southeast Asia. And these are areas that have often been completely left out of the whole problem of the origins of the arts, and particularly the whole question of the origins of human symbolism. But as I mentioned at the very beginning, they are now key areas for this question. And Europe looks to be the end of something rather than the start of something, which is a pretty dramatic change in our perspective. Thank you so much for your attention.